Human beings can be very short sighted, but what can the past and the present tell us about the future? Conversations on the Future is an attempt to rise above the noise of daily news and look at larger trends and ideas that we really should be focusing on and preparing for. I speak with Dr. Graham Allison, renowned political scientist, author of many books, and the founding dean of Harvard's Kennedy School. We discuss great power competition and, in particular, the future of the United States.
DC has become an acronym for dysfunctional capital. But I don't think we've exhausted our 9 lives if that's what we've had. Well, the U.S. is as troubled as I've seen in my lifetime, but as a person who at least reads history, this is not the first time we've found ourselves in dire straits. President Biden is one of his favorite lines that he often quotes is the warning from Lincoln, which is actually Lincoln borrowed from Scripture, which says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." So the level of partisan division in the U.S. today is paralytic, and you can see that in Washington, where I've written DC has become an acronym for dysfunctional capital. And you watch it every day. So I would say U.S. is in pretty dire straits today. That's point one. Point two, we've been here before. So in the Great Depression, if you go back to 1932, Arthur Schlesinger's wonderful first volume on the Franklin Roosevelt administration is called The End of the Old Order. And everybody believed that free market capitalism and as a basis for democracy had failed, and therefore one were going to have some radical alternative to free markets and democracy. And that was a consensus view in 1932-33 in the Great Depression. When Lincoln offered his stark warning about a house divided, this was in 1858, just 3 years before its point came to a head, and the Civil War broke out. And in the Civil War in the U.S., more Americans killed more Americans than all the other world wars that the U.S. has been involved with combined. So we did almost, have 2 countries or more. And if you go back even to 1776, if you take the world at the end of 1776, as David McCullough's wonderful book 1776, which if you haven't read is a great read. At the end of 1776, it's pretty clear the U.S. has lost its effort to rebel and create a separate country from the U.K.
Going back to a book you and Bob Blackwell published in 2013 on Lee Kuan Yew, and among the questions you asked him was, can the U.S. stop China's rise? And his answer was, the U.S. cannot stop China's rise. It just has to live with a bigger China. And now, almost 10 years later, does the evidence point to the U.S. accepting a China that is a challenge to its global hegemony?
Well, I would say yes and no. Apologies for being professorial, but Lee Kuan Yew was I would say one of the grand strategists of our, lifetimes. I only know 2 people like this, Lee Kuan Yew and Henry Kissinger, and he was able to see into situations to get to the heart of the matter, and often to find a way to express it so much more pointedly than most of us who go blah, blah, blah. But in any case, he was putting this proposition provocatively, But it was his forecast that China was rising and would be the biggest player in the history of the world, as he put it, and that the impact of this on Americans and on American psychology was going to be profound, and that it was going to become a fact. So that's the yes. It would be a fact that China would be as big and strong in many dimensions as the US. And now the no part would be, but would psychologically and perceptually, and in terms of your policy, would be a difficult adjustment for the US to make. And so I think he was right on both counts.
In fact, there seems to be almost a hysteria or paranoia in some quarters that China does want to change the world and the US cannot tolerate that. So where do you think this is going?
In Thucydidean and rivalries, if I put this back in the conceptual framework that seems to me the most relevant, there's an axiom that says in your domestic politics, never let anyone get to your right on an issue of national security. So I write that in my 2017 book because the main idea there is that this meteoric rising China would impact a colossal ruling US in a way analogous to the storyline we've seen repeatedly in history, and about which Thucydides wrote brilliantly in classical Greece 2,500 years ago. So as a rising power impacts a ruling power, the impact on the psychology and politics of the ruling power is such that parties begin to first say, no, we're not going to recognize it. Secondly, as they recognize it, well, how did this happen? Who didn't do something? So try to find somebody to blame. And then in the domestic politics, and you saw this in Athens and Sparta in the classical Greece case, you saw this in Great Britain as Germany rose, and you're seeing this in the US today, that people are running to see who can be tougher on China than the alternative. And so the Biden administration, I think, has run scared, not wanting to have people on their right. And the further they move, the further their opponents move, because this is a game that can become almost hysterical. So it's very hard. I mean, China, sensible views about China are regarded as somewhat suspect by many in the Washington political game today.
So what do you foresee in the future of the United States in particular?
Going back to Lee Kuan Yew, where we started, I talked to Lee Kuan Yew about this many times, and he had an interesting theory. He said the U.S. has some magical black box, he called it, in which after having screwed up things almost to the point of disaster, somehow out of the ashes, Phoenix rises, and the U.S. reinvents itself. And in fact, I think in my book I describe Lee Kuan Yew's account of his conversations with Xi Jinping about this, because Xi Jinping thinks what he's doing is remaking the Communist Party-led autocracy that governs China. And he asked Lee Kuan Yew, well, you tell me these Americans have had this capacity for magical reinvention. How do they do that? And Lee Kuan Yew said, well, there must be a black box of some sort. So Xi Jinping said, well, where is that black box, or what is it? How does it work? So he was using just a metaphor to say there's something slightly mysterious about it. But in the weaknesses of America, reflected in the current divisions, is this capacity to criticize ourselves, to recognize the reality, and then, God willing, from time to time to overcome these obstacles. So part of the reason I'm optimistic is that, we've done this before. Though you wouldn't want to be overconfident, because in the in the story of the cat that had 9 lives. The 10th time, that cat dies. But I don't think we've exhausted our 9 lives if that's what we've had, though I have a difficult time describing what the process is likely to be for recovery in the short term, where I see things. If I look at the contrast between Biden's speech in Georgia and Mitch McConnell's speech, I think this House is continuing to divide, and Lincoln was right, a divided House cannot stand. So I think we need a reinvention.
And to a broader question, in fact, the world in general is in some disarray. We have escalating conflicts right now in the Horn of Africa. We have a belligerent Russia. And then in the background is the stressor of climate change, which will impact water and food security, trigger migration, and so forth. So it is generally an anxious time, and sometimes it is hard to be optimistic about the future in terms of stability. What are your thoughts on how, if I may ask you to look at your crystal ball?
Optimists and pessimists are more born in terms of their genes or chemistry or outlook. I'm an inveterate optimist. So you remember the story about the two children, the twins who come home to find a room full of manure, and one of them is crying, the other one is piling into the manure, looking for there must be a pony somewhere in this pile. So I'm always looking for the pony in the pile. I think that there are many challenges, and you mentioned, you started down the list today, that nations, U.S. faces, but globally, everybody faces. The climate issue is something we haven't seen before or haven't recognized before in history, and will require adaptation, especially by the big emitters, the U.S. and China, in constraining their greenhouse gas emissions, that they will find extremely painful, and in which trying to find a way in which I persuade you have to constrain your greenhouse gases, and you persuade me, and we find some area of accommodation, very, very tough. So whether and how and to what extent the web and social media and avalanche of noise that overwhelms people every day is it making us dumber? I think in many ways, unfortunately, it may be. Or is it dumbing down or splintering our politics in ways that it didn't before? Maybe it is. And then, of course, we have viruses like COVID, and we can go on down the list. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you were a Martian analyst looking at the world today, you would say, never before have people had such a good situation. More people are living longer, healthier, wealthier, more productive lives today than ever before in history. And the number of the explosiveness in which science and technology is finding new ways to improve our lives, my goodness, to have a vaccine for COVID within 10 months when the storyline had always been it takes 10 years to make a vaccine. Well, no, excuse me. It took 10 months to make a very effective vaccine. So I think there are a number of reasons for optimism. And but if you ask, well, objectively, can you be objective about this? I would say, no, it's mainly a matter, or it may substantially be a matter of temperament. It would take a lot to make me pessimistic.
Given that we have both mentioned Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore, what advice would you have for smaller states like Singapore, for instance, in a world in greater disarray and perhaps greater conflict?
Well, I would say follow the lead of Lee Kuan Yew and Loon, the Prime Minister today, whom I think is very much in his father's mold and footsteps, which is to make the most successful a city state that you can. Make a state that Singapore and Singaporeans can be proud of. Whatever the challenge, get your act together and deal with it. And actually, watching the way Singapore's dealt with the COVID challenge is, to me, fascinating. Where, yes, it's only, 6.5 million people, but excuse me, that's bigger than New York City. So, yes, it's just a city state, but it has a very big border with Malaysia and lots of people coming back and forth and across. So in many ways, it's not like, Taiwan has an easier case where if you were just simply an island. So I would say taking the challenges as they come and overcoming them. And then secondly, again, this is following in the footsteps of Lee Kuan Yew, managing to live among the elephants agilely and adapting, but maintaining your own identity. And I think the ways in which Singapore has shown it's a valuable independent state in the neighborhood of China, and therefore having to live with a bigger, stronger, and more assertive China, at the same time maintaining a very tight relationship with the U.S., and then trying to help build, the degree of global order in ASEAN and the others. So I would say keep on keeping on.
Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you, Professor Graham Allison. Thank you so much for your time today. That was a pleasure.
So thank you.